you talk, I guess then let's go through like the history of what happened with the ANC. What is the process by which I still would say probably the most iconic liberation movement in the world, and really at a time when there was Africa just had so many incredible leaders, so the ANC still stood out. And it was a party that had a alliance with the labor union movement, had an alliance with the South African Communist Party. What are the conditions through which they achieve liberation but give up on their economic goals? And yeah, let's just start with that. What is
Yeah.
the history of that?
So the African National Congress is an interesting political formation because it doesn't really have any specific identity. So rather than viewing it as this social democratic party, which a lot of people are predisposed to viewing it as, I think it's better understood as being this broad tent formation and a revolutionary nationalist front whose main political goal and reason for being was to achieve emancipation for Black South Africans during the apartheid era. And so when it was unbanned in 1990, it had entered the South African political landscape after years of carrying out its work in exile, because most of its foremost political leaders were sent into prison in the 1960s, Nelson Mandela being the most famous of them, and had to carry out a lot of its activities in other countries and in clandestine ways. So when it enters the scene in 1990, it comes into a set of conditions which are pretty hostile. So there are adverse local conditions, which is to say that a lot of South African domestic capital is, and this capital at the time is still largely white, are unsure of the political trajectory that the country is going to follow. And it's entering a set of hostile international conditions, which is during a time when neoliberal globalization is strengthening and it emerges as the global consensus. So it arrives on the scene at the end of history and in a lot of ways has to march with the path that history dictates. But I think at the same time, though, one thing about the ANC is that when it came into the scene then, it had underdeveloped its economic policy. So during the negotiation period between 1990 and 1994, it focused a lot of its attention on the political ideological project of nation building, of trying to unite these races, which had previously been antagonistic to each other and existed in a relationship of hierarchy and subordination. And it neglected the questions of how to accomplish socioeconomic transformation. And I think that during that intense 4-year period, as much as a lot of people would portray it as being a situation where the ANC's hands were tied and it's effectively had to accept its marching orders from international finance institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, it did have glimpses of possibly pursuing an alternative path. So in 1991, for example, it developed the Macroeconomic Research Group, which produced this working paper called Making Democracy Work, which sort of recommended a neo-Keynesian redistributive growth path for South Africa. And in 1994, it formally adopted the Reconstruction and Development Plan, which was going to continue the spirit of social democratic redistribution. But because it had underdeveloped its economic policies, I think it left itself vulnerable to to economic orthodoxy prevailing. And that's effectively what happened in that period, when it hadn't really given much attention to how it was going to implement a lot of these ambitions and effectively accepted what a lot of economically connected and elites were telling it to do at the time.
So then what is the parallel story with policing? Because again, it's like that seems like such a direct parallel because, okay, there's the military, the security forces, the police are an instrument of apartheid. They're the physical manifestation of racist terror of the apartheid regime. Then we go, and on one hand, I'm assuming, there's going to be changes at the top. There's going to be different types of representation. But then beyond that, what's happening? I mean, what in terms of changing the policies of the police, the issues, as you were talking about, in terms of policing the periphery related to it. And also, is South Africa a pioneer in kind of the rise of private policing services as well?
Yeah. So I think to answer that question, I think in the 1990s, there was a concerted effort to try and transform the character of policing. Obviously, policing in South Africa had, until then and until now, been the symbol of brutal repression. And the goal was to try and make it something that would be rendered as a public service. So the big symbolic change is that it moves from being the South African police force to the South African police service. And its main mission was, the hope would be, to provide public safety. But I think what the South African case demonstrates is how the goal of public safety provision runs up against the demands of capital and of maintaining the social and economic order. And I think this was the case even when explaining the rise of privatization in South Africa's policing and security forces, because the privatization turn really began in the 1970s after the June 16 uprisings in 1976. And when the government then of P.W. Botha decided that what should happen is, rather than sending in the troops and sending police forces into townships, a lot of these activities could be outsourced as a more politically palatable option, or at least that was the hope, what the perception would be. And so this privatization begins in the 1970s and carries on during the post-democratic era. Because, I mean, one thing that's definitive of South Africa's post-democratic era is an austerity budgeting mindset. So, you know, the policing services have had their budgets cut. They don't receive much funding that capacitates them to do their work. And so people obviously start to view them as being incompetent and incapable, and prefer to outsource the protection of private property to private entities.
You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.